The marble floor of First Continental Bank gleamed under fluorescent lights that seemed too bright, too clean for the small girl standing at the counter with mud still drying on her shoes. Her name was Kenya, and she was 12 years old, though the exhaustion in her eyes made her seem both younger and infinitely older. The teller behind the glass partition hadn't looked up yet, hadn't acknowledged the quiet presence of this child who'd walked 3 miles in the rain to be here, whose fingers clutched a worn envelope against her chest like it contained the last piece of her heart. When the woman finally raised her eyes, her expression shifted from professional disinterest to something colder, something that made the air between them feel thick with judgment. "Can I help you?" The words came out flat, each syllable a small rejection. Kenya's voice was barely above a whisper. "I need to see my account, please." The teller's name tag read Margaret, and Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line as she took in the child before her, the torn jacket, the 2 small jeans with holes at the knees, the backpack that looked like it had survived a war, the hair that hadn't seen a proper comb in days. "Sweetheart, this is a bank. You need an adult for account services. Is your mother here?" "She's not." Kenya's grip on the envelope tightened and her voice cracked just slightly. "But I have my grandmother's papers. She told me I have an account here. I need to check it." From somewhere to her left, Kenya heard it, that sound she'd learned to recognize in grocery stores, at school. In every public space, where people thought a poor black child couldn't hear or didn't matter enough to lower their voices. A laugh, short and sharp, from a man in an expensive suit standing at the adjacent counter. His watch caught the light as he turned, and his eyes swept over Kenya with the kind of dismissal usually reserved for insects. "Is this really what we're doing now?" he said, not to Kenya, but to Margaret, as if the girl were invisible. As if she were a problem to be discussed, rather than a human being standing 3 feet away. "I've been waiting 15 minutes for my wire transfer, and we're playing pretend with homeless kids." Margaret's face flushed, but she didn't correct him. Instead, she looked at Kenya with something that might have been pity if it weren't so condescending. "Honey, maybe you should come back with a parent or guardian. We can't just... I have identification." Kenya placed the envelope on the counter, her hands trembling now, and from it she drew a birth certificate, a social security card encased in plastic, and a handwritten note on paper that had been folded and unfolded so many times the creases had gone soft. "My grandmother said there's an account in my name. She said I could check it when I needed to." "I need to now," the man in the suit scoffed, loud enough that people at the other end of the lobby turned to look. "This is absurd. Look at her. She probably found those papers in a dumpster." He stepped closer, and Kenya could smell his cologne, something expensive that made her stomach turn. "You're wasting everyone's time, kid. Why don't you run along before security has to escort you out?" Kenya's jaw tightened, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks, that familiar burning shame that came with being seen as less than. As nothing, as a problem. But she didn't move. She'd come too far. The night before, when the electricity had been shut off again, and her aunt had cried in the darkness of their 1-bedroom apartment, when there'd been nothing for dinner except crackers and hope. Kenya had remembered her grandmother's words, whispered on a hospital bed 3 months before she died. "When things get bad, baby, when you need help, go to First Continental. There's something there for you." Something I made sure of. Margaret was looking at the papers now, her fingers hovering over them like they might contaminate her perfectly manicured nails. "I'll need to verify this with a manager," she said, her tone suggesting this was an enormous inconvenience. "It's going to take some time." "I can wait," Kenya said quietly. "Of course you can," the man muttered, checking his phone with theatrical impatience. "Because you clearly have nothing better to do, no school, no supervision. Just wandering into banks pretending to have accounts." Another customer, a woman with a designer handbag, leaned toward her companion and whispered, but whispers in marble lobbies carry. "I feel bad for her, but this is exactly what's wrong. No structure, no guidance. Someone should call child services." Kenya felt her throat tighten, felt the familiar sting behind her eyes that meant tears were close, but she blinked them back hard. She would not cry here. She would not give them that. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her spine straight despite everything, while Margaret disappeared into a back office with her papers. Leaving her alone at the counter with the eyes of strangers picking her apart, judging every thread of her existence. The man in the suit moved closer to the counter, positioning himself as if to make a point. "You know what this is?" he said to no one in particular, but loud enough for everyone. "This is what happens when people don't teach their kids reality." Someone filled this girl's head with fantasies about money and accounts and entitlement, and now she's here, disrupting business, making a scene. Kenya turned to look at him then. Really look at him, and what he saw in her eyes made him pause for just a second. There was no fear there, no apology, just a quiet, devastating dignity that seemed impossible for someone so young, someone wearing shoes held together with duct tape. "I'm not disrupting anything," she said, her voice steady now. "I'm just trying to access what belongs to me." "Nothing here belongs to you," he shot back, recovering his swagger. "Trust me, kid. I've been banking here for 20 years. I know how this works. They're humoring you because they're too polite to throw you out, but we both know how this ends." The minutes stretched like hours. Other customers came and went, their transactions smooth and quick, while Kenya stood at the counter like a fixture, like something forgotten. A security guard drifted closer, his hand resting casually near his radio, his presence a silent threat. The whispers continued, a constant low buzz of judgment and assumption. A mother pulled her young son away from where he'd been staring at Kenya, as if poverty might be contagious. An elderly couple shook their heads in synchronized disapproval. When Margaret finally emerged from the back office, she wasn't alone. Behind her walked a branch manager, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses and an expression that suggested he'd already decided how this would end before even seeing Kenya's face. His name tag identified him as Mr. Whitmore, and he carried Kenya's papers like they might soil his hands. "Young lady," he began, and his tone was the same one people use when explaining simple concepts to very simple minds. "I've reviewed your documents, and while they appear to reference an account number, I'm unable to verify your authorization to access it. The account in question requires adult supervision and—" "What account?" The man in the suit had moved even closer now, emboldened by official backup. "What's the balance, let me guess?" $50 from a church charity, $100 from a well-meaning teacher, and she thought she could come in here like she's making a withdrawal from a trust fund, Mr. Whitmore's face twitched with something that might have been irritation, but he didn't address the interruption. "The point is, without proper adult authorization, I cannot grant you access to account information. I'm going to have to ask you to leave and return with a legal guardian." Kenya's hands were shaking now, not with fear but with frustration. With the weight of a system designed to keep people like her locked out. "My grandmother opened this account. She's gone. I don't have parents. I live with my aunt, and she's working a double shift because we need the money, because our landlord is threatening to evict us, because everything is falling apart. And my grandmother told me there was help here. She promised me." The vulnerability in those words seemed to hang in the air, naked and raw, and for a moment something shifted in Mr. Whitmore's expression. But the man in the suit laughed, actually laughed, a sound that echoed off the marble and made Kenya flinch. "Let me get this straight," he said, addressing the small crowd that had gathered now, because nothing draws people like the spectacle of someone else's humiliation. "She wants us to believe her dead grandmother set up some secret account, that she's supposed to have access to money, that she's somehow entitled to waltz in here looking like she slept under a bridge and make demands. This is what fraud looks like, people. This is why we have regulations." "I'm not lying," Kenya said, and her voice broke on the last word, the crack in her composure finally showing. "I'm not. Sure you're not," the man replied, his smile cruel. "And I bet that account has, what, $1 million, $2 million. Should we all wait around for your yacht to arrive?" The crowd tittered, uncomfortable laughter that people produce when they're watching something ugly but can't look away. "Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation. "Sir, please, this isn't helpful. Miss, I'm sympathetic to your situation, truly, but the rules are clear. I need you to gather your papers and check the account." The voice came from the back of the lobby, quiet but carrying absolute authority, and every head turned toward its source. An elderly black woman in an immaculate navy suit was walking toward them, her heels clicking on the marble with measured precision. Her hair was silver, pulled back in a perfect bun, and her eyes behind designer frames were sharp enough to cut glass. She carried herself like someone who'd spent a lifetime refusing to be diminished, and the air seemed to shift as she approached. Mr. Whitmore blinked, his professional mask slipping. "Mrs. Harrison, I didn't realize you were in the building. This is just a minor situation we're handling." "You're handling it poorly, Mrs. Harrison said, and though her voice never rose above conversational level, everyone heard every word. "This child has presented documentation requesting access to account information. Your job is to verify and assist, not to humiliate and dismiss, so I'll say it again. Check the account." The man in the suit stepped forward, his face reddening. "Now wait just a minute. Who are you to come in here and, Mrs. Harrison turned to look at him, and whatever she saw in his expensive suit and self-important posture seemed to amuse her in a way that had nothing to do with humor. "I'm Evelyn Harrison. I sit on the board of directors of First Continental's parent company. I'm also the person who's been standing in the wealth management suite for the past 20 minutes, watching this disaster unfold on the security monitors." "And you are?" The man's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. Around them, the crowd had gone silent, the kind of silence that precedes earthquakes. "Mrs. Harrison didn't wait for his answer. She turned to Mr. Whitmore, and her expression made it clear this wasn't a request. "The account number is on those papers. Pull it up. Now, Mr. Whitmore's hands trembled slightly as he took the documents back from Kenya, as he moved to the computer terminal, as he typed with fingers that suddenly seemed uncertain. Kenya watched his face as the screen loaded, watched his eyes widen, watched the color drain from his cheeks like someone had opened a valve. "That's not possible," he whispered. "What's not possible?" Mrs. Harrison asked, her voice still calm, still controlled. Mr. Whitmore looked up at Kenya, then at Mrs. Harrison, then back at his screen as if it might have changed. "The account balance, it's showing. It can't be right. There must be an error in the system." "There's no error," Mrs. Harrison said. "Now I'm going to ask you one more time. What is the account balance?" The man in the suit had gone very still, his earlier bravado evaporating like steam. Margaret had backed away from the counter, her hand over her mouth. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for the reversal they could sense coming. Mr. Whitmore swallowed hard. $50 million. The account holds $50 million, and it's in the name of Kenya Marie Johnson, with access granted upon her 12th birthday or in the event of financial hardship. Whichever comes first. The words landed like bombs, each one destroying another assumption, another judgment, another whispered cruelty. Kenya felt her knees go weak, felt the room tilt, felt Mrs. Harrison's hand steady on her shoulder. $50 million, someone in the crowd breathed. The man in the suit looked like he might be sick. His face had gone from red to gray, and he stepped back, stumbling slightly, as if distance might undo what had just happened. "That's impossible. She's just a kid, she's—" "Look at her. I am looking at her," Mrs. Harrison said, and now there was steel in her voice, the kind that could cut through bone. "I'm looking at a young woman who walked 3 miles in the rain to access what legally belongs to her. I'm looking at someone who maintained her dignity while you, a grown man, mocked her poverty, questioned her honesty, and suggested she was committing fraud. I'm looking at someone with more grace in her little finger than you've shown in your entire performance this morning." She turned to Mr. Whitmore, who looked like he wanted the floor to swallow him. "This child's grandmother was Dorothy Mee Johnson. Dorothy worked as a housekeeper for the Rothschild family for 40 years. When Jonathan Rothschild made his fortune in pharmaceuticals, he never forgot that Dorothy had cleaned his first office, had believed in him when he was nobody, had loaned him her own savings to help him make payroll during his darkest month. When he died, he left Dorothy Mee Johnson a substantial portion of his estate, with the stipulation that it be held in trust for any grandchildren, to be accessed when they needed it most. Mrs. Harrison's eyes swept the crowd, landing on each face that had judged, each person who had whispered, each soul who had found entertainment in a child's humiliation. Dorothy died 3 months ago, but she made sure her granddaughter would be taken care of. She made sure that when the world was cruel, when the systems failed, when people looked at this brilliant young woman and saw only her clothes and her skin and her circumstances, there would be proof that she mattered, that she was valued, that someone had loved her enough to build her a foundation. Kenya couldn't stop the tears now. They fell hot and fast, washing away the dust of the long walk, the residue of shame, the weight of every dismissive glance. Mrs. Harrison's hand remained on her shoulder, an anchor in the storm of emotion. "I want a formal apology issued to Miss Johnson," Mrs. Harrison continued, addressing Mr. Whitmore. "I want a detailed report on my desk tomorrow explaining your security protocols for vulnerable customers, and how this branch plans to ensure that wealth verification never precedes basic human dignity. And I want this gentleman's account information." The man in the suit flinched as if struck. "What? Why, I didn't do anything illegal." "You did something worse," Mrs. Harrison said quietly. "You revealed exactly who you are when you think no one important is watching. First Continental has a code of ethics and a community standard. Clients who abuse other customers, particularly children, particularly in ways that involve racial and socioeconomic prejudice, are clients we can choose not to serve. I'll be reviewing whether your continued patronage aligns with our values." The man opened his mouth to protest, seemed to think better of it, grabbed his briefcase and left with quick, desperate steps, his exit watched by dozens of eyes that had cheered his cruelty minutes before. Margaret was crying now, quiet tears of shame. Other customers had begun to disperse, unable to meet Kenya's eyes, the entertainment value of the spectacle soured by its resolution. Mrs. Harrison turned fully to Kenya, her expression softening. "Your grandmother and I were friends. Did she ever mention me?" Kenya shook her head, unable to speak. "We met at a charity function 20 years ago. I just made my first million in commercial real estate, and I was so proud of myself, so sure I'd arrived. Dorothy was working the coat check, and when I tipped her extravagantly trying to show off my new wealth, do you know what she did?" Kenya shook her head again. "She handed it back. Told me kindness didn't require cash, and if I really wanted to do good, I should invest in my community, not my ego. She changed my entire approach to philanthropy, to business, to life. When she told me about this trust, about you, she made me promise something. She made me promise that if you ever needed help, if you ever walked into a bank alone and afraid, someone would be watching. Someone would make sure you were treated like the treasure you are." Kenya found her voice small and broken. "I didn't know, she never told me. I thought maybe there was a few $100s, maybe enough to pay the electric bill, to buy groceries. I never imagined. She wanted you to know you were worth more than the world might tell you," Mrs. Harrison said gently. "She wanted you to have choices, education, security, freedom. The money is yours, Kenya. It's real. And we're going to make sure you have the guidance and support to use it wisely, to honor Dorothy's sacrifice and Jonathan Rothschild's gratitude." Mr. Whitmore cleared his throat, his face still pale. "Miss Johnson, I owe you a profound apology. There's no excuse for how you were treated today. I should have investigated immediately, should have shown you the respect you deserved regardless of what our systems showed. I failed you and I'm deeply sorry." Kenya looked at him, this man who'd been ready to throw her out, who'd let others mock her, who'd seen her tears and felt no urgency. "I just wanted someone to believe me," she whispered. "I know," he said, and to his credit, he looked genuinely devastated. "And we didn't. That's on me. That's on all of us." Mrs. Harrison guided Kenya to a private office, away from the stares and whispers, and for the next 2 hours, they talked about trusts and investments, about education funds and financial advisors, about Dorothy's love and Jonathan Rothschild's legacy. They talked about Kenya's aunt, who would be brought into the process, who would share in the relief and the opportunity. They talked about the apartment with no electricity and how that would never be a problem again. They talked about school and dreams and futures that had seemed impossible just this morning. When Kenya finally left the bank, the sun had broken through the clouds and the rain had stopped. Mrs. Harrison walked her out personally, and at the door, the elderly woman pulled her into a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and felt like forgiveness. "Your grandmother loved you so much," Mrs. Harrison whispered. "She wanted you to know that you were never alone, even when she couldn't be there. Even when the world was hard." Kenya held on to her, this stranger who'd become a guardian angel, and let herself feel it, all of it. The grief and the relief and the overwhelming weight of being seen, really seen after so long invisible. As she walked home, her backpack felt lighter despite carrying the paperwork that proved her new reality. The 3-mile journey seemed shorter somehow, the world less hostile. She passed people on the street who looked at her and still saw only what they wanted to see. A poor black girl in torn clothes, someone to pity or ignore. But Kenya walked with her head high now, carrying the knowledge that her grandmother had loved her enough to build her a bridge over the cruelest waters. That someone had believed she was worth $50 million in protection and possibility. When she reached her aunt's apartment building, she took the stairs 2 at a time, burst through the door, and found Lashonda sleeping on the couch after her double shift, still in her work uniform. Too exhausted to even make it to the bedroom. Kenya stood there for a long moment, watching her aunt's chest rise and fall, thinking about all the sacrifices, all the extra shifts. All the times Lashonda had given Kenya the bigger portion when there wasn't enough food, had let her have the bedroom while sleeping on this broken couch. Had loved her fiercely despite having nothing to give but that love. "Auntie," Kenya whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. "Wake up, I need to tell you something. Everything's going to be okay now. Everything's going to be different." And as Lashonda's eyes opened, confused and still heavy with exhaustion, Kenya told her about the bank, about the account, about Dorothy's gift and Mrs. Harrison's intervention, and the $50 million that meant they'd never have to choose between electricity and food again, never have to fear eviction, never have to measure love in what they couldn't provide. Lashonda cried, and Kenya cried with her, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, they were tears of relief instead of desperation. But later, when the tears had dried and the shock had settled into something closer to reality, Kenya found herself thinking not about the money, but about the moment in the bank. About standing at that counter while strangers judged her worth by her appearance, while a man in an expensive suit had looked at her and seen nothing, no one, a problem to be removed. She thought about how close she'd come to walking away, to believing them, to accepting their assessment of her value. And she understood, with a clarity that seemed too old for her years, that Dorothy's real gift wasn't the money. It was the proof that she'd mattered to someone, that she'd been worth protecting, that her life had value beyond what could be measured in torn clothes and empty refrigerators. The $50 million would change her circumstances, would open doors and create opportunities, would let her and Lashonda breathe for the first time in years. But the knowledge that her grandmother had seen her, had planned for her, had loved her enough to build this impossible bridge. That was the treasure that would sustain her through every difficulty to come. That night, Kenya lay in her bed in the small room she'd have for only a few more weeks before they could move somewhere better, somewhere with heat that worked and walls without cracks. And she whispered to the grandmother she missed with an ache that money couldn't heal. "Thank you," she said into the darkness. "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for knowing I'd need proof that I mattered. Thank you for making sure that, when I was at my lowest, when I was ready to believe what they said about me, there was evidence that someone had valued me at $50 million and beyond. The world is full of people who will look at you and see only what they expect to see. Only what confirms their biases and fears and need to feel superior. They'll see your clothes before your character, your circumstances before your courage, your struggles before your strength. They'll measure your worth in material terms and find you wanting because they've never learned that value and wealth are not the same thing. That dignity cannot be purchased, and character cannot be appraised by the balance in a bank account. But sometimes, if you're lucky, if you're blessed, someone in your life will see past all of that. Someone will recognize your worth when you're too tired and beaten down to remember it yourself. Someone will build you a bridge when you think you're drowning, will leave you proof that you mattered, that you were loved, that your existence was significant enough to merit protection and investment and hope. Kenya's grandmother couldn't protect her from poverty in life, couldn't shield her from the cruelty of a world that judges children by their shoes and their skin. But she'd done something perhaps more important. She'd made sure that when the judgment came, when the world tried to convince Kenya she was worthless, there would be undeniable proof to the contrary. She'd weaponized love into 50 million pieces of evidence that her granddaughter's life had value, that her future deserved investment, that she was worth defending even from beyond the grave. The man in the expensive suit learned something that day too, though whether the lesson lasted beyond his embarrassment is uncertain. He learned that the person you mock, The child you dismiss, the poverty you judge might be harboring worth you can't imagine, might be connected to power you don't see, might be carrying dignity that your wealth could never purchase. He learned that cruelty has consequences, that the audience you perform for might suddenly become your judges, that the satisfaction of punching down lasts only until someone reveals you've been aiming at royalty disguised in rags. But this isn't really a story about money, about bank balances and trust funds and financial reversals, though those elements drive the plot. This is a story about being seen, about the desperate human need to have someone recognize your worth, to have evidence that your life means something beyond what strangers assume when they glance at your surface. This is about the way poverty makes you invisible, how it erases your humanity in the eyes of people who should know better, how it gives others permission to treat you as less than, as a problem, as entertainment. And this is about resistance. About Kenya standing at that counter with mud on her shoes and doubt in her heart but refusing to leave, refusing to accept their assessment. Holding on to her grandmother's promise, even when everything visible suggested she'd been lied to. About maintaining dignity in the face of mockery. About believing you deserve respect even when the world withholds it. About trusting that you matter even when every visible sign suggests otherwise. So when you're standing in your own marble lobby, whatever form it takes, when the world is judging you by all the wrong measures and finding you wanting, when strangers are whispering and powerful people are dismissing, and you're wondering if maybe they're right, maybe you are worthless, maybe you should just leave and stop causing problems. Remember Kenya. Remember that worth isn't determined by clothes or circumstances. That value isn't validated by other people's recognition. That sometimes the proof of your significance is hidden, waiting, building interest in an account you didn't know existed. Remember that the people who judge you harshest often have the least insight into your truth, that mockery says more about the mocker than the mocked. That cruelty is usually just fear wearing a mask of superiority. Remember that you might be carrying Dorothy's love in your pocket, proof that someone saw worth in you when you couldn't see it yourself, evidence that you were valued enough to be protected. Invested in, believed in. And remember above all that the account isn't the point. The point is that you stood there, that you didn't leave. That you demanded to be seen, to be acknowledged, to be treated with the basic dignity every human deserves regardless of what they're wearing, or where they've walked from, or how tired they look. The point is that you refused to disappear just because others found your existence inconvenient. That's worth more than 50 million. That's worth everything.